Arizona Territory, 1879. The wind had teeth that spring morning, biting through the canyon as if it meant to carve its name into the rocks. Cullen Tate rode into the dust-blown wreck of what used to be a homestead, his wide-brimmed hat low over storm-gray eyes. He pulled his horse to a stop when he saw the body. No, not a body. A woman. Barely upright, leaning against the scorched frame of a barn, her face streaked with ash and blood. He dismounted slowly. "You alive?" he asked, voice low and flat from too many years of silence. The woman blinked up at him. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hands scraped raw, and her hair, once gold, was matted with soot. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Cullen crouched beside her, his shadow falling over her like a shield. "Can you stand?" She shook her head, just once, eyes wide with something more than pain. Shock. Maybe. Grief. Her fingers clutched a small cloth-wrapped bundle to her chest like it was the last thing she had in the world. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said. And for the first time in years, he meant every word. She finally spoke. "They took my boy." Cullen's jaw tightened. "Who?" "Bandits," she rasped. "2 days ago. Her voice broke. "They killed my husband. Burned the house. Took my son and left me for dead." Cullen glanced at the blackened ruin behind her. Smoke still clung to the air like a ghost. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Tessa Langley." "I'm Cullen Tate." She looked at him like the name might mean something. Maybe it did. He had a reputation that followed him like a shadow. Heartless drifter, gun for hire, man who rode through towns and left trouble behind like tracks in the dirt. But none of that mattered now. "I buried my baby girl yesterday," Tessa said quietly, eyes falling to the bundle. She was only 6 months old. Fever caught her 3 days before the fire. I didn't even have time to mourn her before they came. Cullen felt something shift in his chest. Not pity. Something heavier. He stood, walked back to his horse, and pulled out his canteen. "Here." She drank like someone who had not tasted water in days. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked up at him. "You gonna leave me here?" "No, why not?" He met her eyes. "Because you still got a boy out there." She stared at him, and for a long minute neither of them said a word. Then Cullen reached down and lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light, and he could feel the tremble in her limbs. He set her gently on the saddle, climbed up behind her, and wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her. "Where would they take him?" he asked. "There's a canyon east of here. Narrow trail, hard to find. My husband said it was used by smugglers and outlaws." Cullen nodded. "Then that's where we go." They rode in silence for hours, the sun climbing higher, the wind still sharp. Tessa leaned against him, too weak to stay upright on her own. Her head rested against his chest, and he could feel her breathing uneven, but steady. He had not touched another human being in over 3 years. Not like this. Not with care. As night fell, they made camp under a bluff. Cullen laid out a blanket, helped her sit, and started a fire with practiced hands. Tessa watched him, her eyes sunken but sharp. "You always ride alone?" she asked. "Yeah. You always stop for dying women?" "No." She gave a short breath of something like a laugh, then winced and wrapped her arms around herself. Cullen handed her a piece of jerky and a tin cup of water. She took both without a word. "You got anyone?" she asked after a while. He shook his head. "Not anymore." She nodded slowly. "Me neither." The fire crackled. Coyotes howled in the distance. Cullen glanced at her. "Your boy. What's his name?" "Farron," she said. "He's 6. Smart. Brave. He would not go easy with them." "He yours and your husband's?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. But Cullen, if we find him and he's hurt—" "We will find him," he said, firm and certain. Tessa looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded again and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. That night, Cullen did not sleep. He sat near the fire, gun resting across his lap, eyes on the dark horizon. He had spent a lifetime riding away from things. This time, he was riding toward something. The next morning, they rode again. Tessa was stronger, holding herself up in the saddle, jaw set. She said little, but her eyes never stopped scanning the land around them. By midday, they reached the mouth of the canyon. It was narrow and steep, the kind of place that swallowed men whole. Cullen tied the horse and helped Tessa down. "You stay here," he said. "No," he looked at her. "I came this far. I am not waiting behind while you bring my son out alone." Cullen did not argue. He just nodded. They moved slow through the canyon, the walls rising high on both sides. After half a mile, Cullen raised a hand and stopped. Voices. Laughter. They crept closer, staying low behind the rocks. There were 3 men seated around a fire, and beside them tied up, dirty, but alive was a boy with blonde hair and a defiant scowl. Tessa gasped. "Farron." Cullen turned to her. "Stay here." "No, I mean it. One wrong move and they could—" "I am going," she said, her voice low and fierce. Cullen studied her face. Then he nodded once and handed her a small revolver. "If it comes to it, aim for the chest. Do not hesitate." She took the gun with shaking hands. Cullen moved like smoke, silent, quick. He circled around the camp, waited for the moment when all 3 men were distracted, then stepped out with his rifle raised. "Drop your weapons." They jumped to their feet. Farron's eyes went wide. "Mama!" One of the men reached for his gun. Cullen shot him through the shoulder before he could draw. The second man lunged, but Cullen drove the butt of his rifle into the man's face and sent him sprawling. The third man grabbed Farron and pulled a knife. Before Cullen could move, a shot rang out. The man dropped, clutching his side. Tessa stood behind them, the revolver shaking in her hand. Farron ran to her, burying his face against her stomach. She dropped to her knees, holding him close, sobbing into his hair. Cullen watched them, breath catching in his throat. When she looked up, her eyes met Cullen's. "Thank you." He nodded once. "Let's get out of here." They rode out of the canyon with Farron between them. Cullen's arms were wrapped around both of them now. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in copper and fire. And for the first time in years, Cullen Tate felt something real settle in his chest. Something he had not dared to name. Hope. They reached Bisbee by late afternoon, the mining town crouched in the folds of the Mule Mountains, its shanties and saloons clinging to the red earth like barnacles. Cullen led the horse down the narrow main road, careful of the child between them. Tessa sat up straight behind him, arms tight around Farron, her chin lifted though her face was drawn and pale. He dismounted outside the livery stable, helped her down, then lifted Farron gently from the saddle. The boy blinked in the sunlight, squinting up at Cullen but saying nothing. "Stable, keep the horse," Cullen said. "We'll get a room." Tessa followed without question, Farron clutching her hand. They passed 2 prospectors arguing over a claim, a woman sweeping dust from her porch, and a boy hawking stale bread from a basket. The saloon doors swung open ahead, spilling the sound of a fiddle and the stink of whiskey into the street. Cullen steered them past it all and turned down a quieter lane where a small boarding house stood, weathered but clean. The woman who answered the door wore a high collar and a look that had seen its share of sorrow. She took in the soot on Tessa's dress, the bruises on her arms, and the child pressed against her skirts, then stepped aside without asking questions. Cullen paid for 2 rooms, one for them, one for himself, and asked for a basin and hot water. Upstairs, the floor creaked beneath their boots. The room Tessa stepped into was plain. Iron bedstead, washstand, thin curtains. But it had a door that locked and a window that let in sun, and for now that was enough. "I'll be next door," Cullen said. "You knock if anything's wrong." She nodded, fingers smoothing the boy's hair. "We'll be fine." He turned to go. "Cullen." He stopped. "I don't know what comes next." "You don't have to." "Not yet." He shut the door behind him. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. Cullen sat at the edge of his bed, cleaning his rifle in silence. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried and was hushed. He set the rifle aside, stood, and stared at the window until the glass showed nothing but night. The knock came just as he sat again. He opened the door to find Farron standing there barefoot, his shirt too big, eyes wide but dry. "Mama's asleep," the boy said. "She was crying before. I didn't want to wake her." Cullen knelt. "You all right?" Farron nodded. I can't sleep." "You hungry?" The boy shrugged. Cullen fetched a biscuit from his saddlebag and handed it over. Farron bit into it, chewing slow. "You got a plan?" he asked, crumbs on his lip. Cullen raised an eyebrow. "You always ask grown men that?" Farron looked up at him. "Just the ones with guns." Cullen huffed, not quite a laugh. "Yeah, I got a plan." Farron sat on the floor, back against the bed frame. "I ain't scared, you know." "I know. But Mama is." Cullen studied him. "She's still standin'. That counts for something." Farron nodded once, serious. "She don't like to be alone." Cullen said nothing, but after a moment he stood and opened the door to Tessa's room. She hadn't locked it. Inside, the lamp still burned low. She was curled on the bed, one arm over her face, the other stretched toward the empty space beside her. He looked back at Farron. "Go on. She'll rest easier with you near." The boy padded back across the hall, climbed onto the bed without a word. Cullen pulled the door to softly. He didn't sleep that night, not because of noise or worry, but because something had shifted again, deep and quiet. He wasn't a man used to being needed, not in any way that didn't get someone killed. But now he was. By morning, he'd made a choice. When he knocked on Tessa's door, she opened it already dressed, hair tied back, hands still damp from washing. She looked at him with the same calm that had followed her since the canyon, but something in her eyes was clearer now, focused. "We can't stay here," he said. "I know. I've got land west of Dragoon, old claim I never worked. Cabin's still standing. Needs patching, but the well runs clear." Tessa blinked. "You want us to go with you?" "No. I need you to." She didn't answer for a long time. "Then, why?" "Because you're not safe here. Because you don't got anyone else. And because I don't ride off from people I've already bled for." Her hand dropped to her side. "We'd be beholden to you." "No. You'd be building something with me. That's different." A pause. Farron appeared behind her, rubbing his eyes. "You got a garden?" he asked. "Not yet," Cullen said. "But the soil's good." Tessa looked down at her son, then back at Cullen. "How far is it?" 2 days, steady ride." She nodded once. "We'll need to pack." By noon, they were gone from Bisbee. Cullen rode ahead, leading the way west. Tessa sat straight in the saddle behind him, Farron in front, his small hand wrapped around the horn. They didn't speak much on the trail, but something had settled between them, quiet and real and growing with every mile. When they reached the homestead, the sun was low behind the hills. The cabin squatted at the edge of a cottonwood grove, its roof sagging but whole, the door still on its hinges. Dust coated everything, but the air smelled of pine and dry grass. Cullen helped them down, then handed Tessa the key. She turned it in the lock, stepped inside, and looked around. "It's more than I expected." "It's yours now," Cullen said. She turned back to him. "All of it. All of it." Farron ran past them, chasing a jackrabbit toward the trees. Tessa stood at the threshold, the last of the sun catching in her hair. "Why me?" she asked. "Out of all the people you could have passed on the road." He looked at her then, steady and sure. "Because you didn't break." She stepped forward, close enough to touch. "And you?" she asked quietly. "Are you still running?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." She reached up, brushed a finger against the edge of his jaw. "Then we stay," she said. And they did. The roof leaked in 2 places. Cullen patched both by hand the first week, his shoulders aching from the climb and the hammer's recoil. Tessa stood below, steadying the ladder without being asked. She didn't offer advice. She never did. She watched his hands instead, learning the work quietly. By the time the monsoon clouds rolled in, the cabin held dry. The days settled into rhythm. Farron rose with the birds barefoot in the yard before Cullen had finished buckling his belt. Tessa took to the kitchen without ceremony, boiling coffee black and baking flatbread from flour she rationed with quiet precision. She kept the ledger in a small cloth-bound book tucked in the drawer beneath the window, and she never once asked Cullen how much coin he had left. He built a second cot for Farron. The boy helped, watching the way Cullen drove nails, handing him the next piece of pine with careful fingers. "You always live like this?" Farron asked one evening, dragging a smooth stone through the dust while Cullen sharpened a blade by the fire. "I live how I can." The boy nodded. "I think Mama likes it here." Cullen didn't answer. He stood and checked the door latch before the light left the room. That night, Tessa sat on the porch after Farron fell asleep, her knees drawn up beneath her skirt. The air smelled of creosote and distant rain. She didn't speak until Cullen stepped outside and lowered himself beside her. "You always fix things yourself?" "If I can." "You ever fix anything that wasn't wood or iron?" Cullen looked out across the darkening yard. A hawk circled high above the trees, its wings catching the last of the sun. "Not till now, maybe." She didn't look at him. "I used to help my father with the census. We traveled by wagon, took names, counted heads, marked down ages. I saw more of this territory than most men." "What made you stop?" "I married a man who didn't like me gone." Said a wife belonged still. "Did you believe him?" She turned her head then. "I tried to." Cullen nodded, slow. "You ever miss the road?" She folded her hands. "I miss knowing what comes next. But I don't miss the dust." They sat quiet a while. The night settled deep. An owl called from the grove. "I never thought I'd be raising Farron somewhere like this," she said, voice low. "Someplace quiet. With a man who doesn't talk unless he's got reason." Cullen leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "You think that's a fault?" "No," her voice was soft. "I think it's a relief." The next morning, she brought down the old ledger and laid it on the table. "We'll need more seed if I'm to get a proper kitchen garden going," she said. "And the boy's outgrowing his boots." Cullen looked over her list. "I'll ride north, trade the spare rifle. Won't be gone more than 3 days. Take Farron." He raised his eyes. "If you want him to learn how to live out here, he needs to see it. He listens when you speak, Cullen. He watches you." Cullen didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. 2 days later, they rode out before dawn, the boy seated behind him, arms around Cullen's waist, breath warm against his back. The road to Fairbank was narrow and rutted, but they made it by afternoon. Cullen traded the rifle for seed, a pair of boots, and a tin of coffee he didn't need but knew Tessa would use. They slept on the trail that night, Farron curled beneath a blanket, his head on Cullen's bedroll. "You ever want a son?" the boy asked, eyes open in the firelight. "No," Cullen said. "Why not?" "Didn't think I'd live long enough to teach one anything useful." Farron was quiet a moment. "You still think that?" Cullen looked at the boy, small and sharp-eyed and steady. No, Tessa was waiting on the porch when they returned, arms crossed, apron dusted with flour. Farron ran to her, boots clomping too big on the ground, and she caught him with both arms. Cullen dismounted slow, set the seat sack on the porch, and met her gaze. "They fit him?" he asked. She nodded. "He won't take them off." He stepped back, brushing trail dust from his coat. "You want coffee?" she asked. He nodded once. Inside, the fire was low, the smell of cornmeal thick in the air. Farron sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing lines in the ash from the hearth. Tessa poured 2 cups, slid one toward Cullen. Her hand brushed his as he took it. She didn't pull back. "You're not what I expected," she said. "I'm not much of anything." "You're here," she said. "That's more than I knew to ask for." He looked at her then, full. "I never meant to stay anywhere," he said. "I know, but I want to." Tessa's breath caught only slightly. Then she set her cup down, stepped to him, and laid her hand against his chest, just above his heart. "You already have." He kissed her once, slow and sure, her fingers curling against his collar. When they parted, her forehead rested against his, and neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. Inside, the fire burned steady. Nothing rushed. Nothing needed saying that hadn't already been lived. And in that quiet room, the man they once called Heartless found what he never thought to look for. A home. And the woman who made it so. By late summer, the beans climbed halfway up the trellis Tessa built from stripped willow, and the hens Cullen bartered for laid steady in the mornings, their clucking soft beneath the cottonwoods. The cabin stayed cool if she kept the windows open at dawn, and the boy had stopped waking from bad dreams. Cullen returned from the creek with his shirt damp and sleeves rolled, a bundle of smooth stones under one arm. He set them on the stoop without being asked. "You're building again?" Tessa asked from the garden row, a straw hat shading her face. "Thought I'd line the well path. Keep it from turning to mud when the rains come." She stood slowly, hand pressed to the small of her back. "You always think ahead, only when it's for someone else." She smiled, but it wasn't the kind that passed quick. It stayed, settling into her eyes. "I'm not used to that." "You should be." Inside, Farron had emptied the drawer of kindling and was sorting twigs by size along the floorboards. "You planning to sell bundles?" Cullen asked as he stepped through the door. "No," the boy said, not looking up. "Mama said I should make myself useful." "She say that or you decide it?" Farron shrugged and kept sorting. The next day brought a rider to the edge of the property, a young man with a canvas satchel and a dappled mare too fine for the trail. Cullen watched from the porch as he approached, his hand resting near the butt of his holstered pistol. The man dismounted slow, squinting through the heat shimmer. "I'm looking for Mrs. Langley," he said. Tessa stepped past Cullen to the edge of the yard, her hands dry from flour. "You found her." The man removed his hat. "Name's Elijah Croft. I work for the territorial office in Tucson. Your husband filed a land dispute before the fire. The claim's been settled. I'm here to deliver the deed." Tessa took the envelope without a word. She opened it with steady fingers, read, then folded it once and tucked it into her apron. "You came all this way for that?" Elijah nodded. "Mr. Langley filed it urgent. Guess he had plans." She looked past him to the horizon. "He did, but they weren't the right ones." Elijah glanced toward the cabin, then back at her. "You've rebuilt." "Not alone." He turned to Cullen. "You the hired man?" "No," Tessa laid a hand on Cullen's arm. "He's the one who brought me out of it." Elijah hesitated, then dipped a shallow nod. "Well, paper's yours now. No one can take it from you." "I know," she said. He left before dusk, the dust of his trail still hanging in the air when Cullen joined her by the fence. "You didn't ask me if I wanted to keep it," he said. "It's your land." She looked down at the paper in her hand. "Not anymore. It's ours." That night, Cullen carried an armful of split hickory to the pile behind the cabin. Tessa met him at the corner post, her shawl draped over her shoulders. "You ever marry before?" she asked. "No, why not?" He leaned the wood against the post. "Never knew anyone who didn't want something I couldn't give." "And what about now?" He looked at her, the light from the kitchen window soft behind her. "Now I want to give it." She stepped closer, the edge of her hand brushing his. "Farron asked me if we were already a family." "What did you tell him?" "I said yes." Cullen reached up, tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "He's right." She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, and they stood there a long while, the sky above them stitched with stars, the sound of the night wind threading through the trees. In the morning, Tessa wore a blue dress he hadn't seen before, the hem mended twice over. She packed bread and dried apples into a basket, tied it shut, and handed it to Farron. "We're riding into town," she said. Cullen saddled the horse without asking why. Bisbee was louder than he remembered, the streets thick with wagons and travelers, the scent of molasses and iron mingling in the air. Tessa led them to the church at the far end of town, the one with whitewashed siding and a bell that rang too sharp. Inside, the pews were empty, the morning light slanting through colored glass. A man in a plain collar looked up from a ledger. "We'd like to speak our vows," Tessa said. Cullen hadn't known she meant to do it then, but he didn't hesitate. The preacher asked no questions. Farron stood between them, holding both their hands, solemn as a judge. Outside beneath the sycamores, Tessa turned to Cullen. They called you a heartless drifter. He touched the ring she now wore, simple brass polish to shine. Maybe I was. She shook her head. You were only waiting. That night, they sat on the porch again, Farron asleep behind the shuttered window, the sky pulsing with late summer heat. I never thought I'd have this, she said. Peace that doesn't cost me everything. Cullen took her hand. It's yours now, and I'll keep it with you. She leaned against him and they watched the stars rise quiet and unhurried, knowing they would see them again tomorrow from this same place, side by side. The wheatgrass had gone yellow at the tips by the second autumn, brittle from a dry spell that hadn't yet broken. Cullen stood with his back to the fence, mending a split post with a length of wire and a rusted nail pulled from the barn wall. He worked with quiet concentration, sleeves rolled and palms dusted with soil. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Farron's asking about the school in Tombstone, Tessa said, stepping into the light with a folded letter in her hand. One of the women I met at church says they've started lessons for children beyond scripture. Cullen set the hammer down. You think he's ready? He's asking questions I can't always answer. He nodded once, wiping his hands on his trousers. We'll ride in after harvest. Let him see it for himself. She looked down at the letter before folding it again. He's been talking about trains. Says he wants to see one up close. Cullen leaned against the post. I've got a cousin works the freight line near Benson. Could ask him to show Farron the yard. Tessa smiled, a quiet kind of pride in her face. He's growing into his own mind. He's got yours. She walked forward, slipping her arms around his waist. He's got both of us. And I want him to know that matters. Cullen kissed her temple, slow and certain. He does. They walked back to the cabin together. Farron was sitting cross-legged on the porch, carving lines into a strip of bark with a penknife Cullen had given him last winter. He looked up when they approached. Can I ride into the next town with you next time you go? Cullen glanced at Tessa, then back at the boy. You can, but you'll need to keep pace. Farron grinned, his front teeth finally coming in straight. I will. That night, Tessa lit the lantern early, the light catching on the edges of her sewing needle as she mended the hem of a work shirt. Cullen sat nearby, boot off and ankle propped while he relaced a worn spur strap. You ever think about the years before this? She asked, keeping her eyes on the stitch. Sometimes. But they're quiet now. I don't regret anything that brought me here, she said. Cullen looked at her, the firelight drawing gold into the strands of her hair. Not even the worst of it? She shook her head. Grief stripped me bare, but it let me see what mattered. I carried so much trying to be what others expected. Out here, I found what I was meant to be. He rose and crossed the room, crouching beside her chair. And what's that? A woman who knows her own mind. A mother who doesn't flinch. A wife who chose with her whole heart. He took her needle from her gently, set it aside, and lifted her hands in his. I never thought I'd be worth being chosen. Well, she said, you were. They didn't speak again that night, not with words. The silence between them had grown into something rich and warm, a language of touch and presence. She followed him to bed without ceremony, her breath steady against his chest as the wind stirred through the cottonwoods outside. Weeks passed and the harvest came clean. Cullen taught Farron to bundle the stalks tight and carry them without spilling seed. Tessa stored the grain in canvas sacks, labeled with charcoal on small leather tags. She cured squash and strung beans to dry in the pantry rafters, humming under her breath when she thought no one listened. They rode into Tombstone on a clear morning, the boy straight-backed in the saddle beside them. The schoolhouse stood near the edge of town, whitewashed and plain, with children's voices carrying from inside. Tessa waited while Cullen stepped in with Farron. He spoke with the teacher, asked questions Farron didn't know to ask, and left the boy at the threshold with a promise to return by sundown. When he came back out, Tessa took his hand. He'll be all right, she said. I know. They walked together to the mercantile. She picked out a length of deep blue fabric, enough for a new winter dress. while Cullen traded a sack of dried apples for a set of carving tools. Outside, they shared a pear she'd bought for a half-penny. She wiped the juice from his chin with her thumb and laughed when he caught her wrist and kissed the inside of it. That evening, they rode home beneath a lavender sky. Farron talked the whole way, eager and breathless, the words tumbling out faster than his mouth could shape them. They sat close that night, the three of them, on the porch bench Cullen had built from cedar planks. Tessa leaned against her husband, Farron resting against her hip, his voice finally giving way to sleep. "You ever think you'd have this?" she asked, her voice a hush in the dusk. "No," Cullen said. "But I'll spend every breath I've got holding on to it." She turned to him, her eyes full with the weight of everything they'd built, and kissed him slow, her hand resting over his heart. They didn't speak again. They didn't have to. Years later, the cottonwoods grew taller, shading the cabin through long summers. Farron outgrew his boots twice more and started carving small animals from driftwood. He rode into town alone by 16 and came home every time with a story and a smile. Tessa's garden stretched wider, spilling into the field behind the barn. She taught him to read ledgers to grow things. Cullen taught him to hold the line when storms rose, to speak only when he meant it. They never left that land, not once. Not because they were afraid to go, but because everything they needed, everything they'd fought for, bled for, built with their bare hands was already there. And every night when the fire sank low and the porch turned dark, Cullen would reach for Tessa's hand and she would always be there, ready to take it. Together. Always.